I found out my sibling was behind my parents' divorce. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when the first cracks in my family's foundation began to show. Up until then, everything had seemed perfect. To the outside world, we were the picture of a happy family. Mom and Dad, their 3 kids, my older brother Ryan, me the middle child, and our youngest Claire, living in a cozy suburban home with the usual chaos that came with raising 3 kids under one roof. We'd always had our issues, of course. Ryan was a golden boy, athletic, charming, and the one Dad always seemed to root for. Claire was the baby, the one who could get away with anything because she was too cute to punish. And then there was me. I was a quiet one, the bookworm who could never seem to live up to the family's expectations. My parents loved me, but I often felt like I was on the outside looking in. I was never quite good enough, no matter how hard I tried. Still, we were a family, or so I thought. The first signs of trouble came subtly. Mom and Dad started having more arguments behind closed doors. Small things at first, who left the dishes in the sink, or why Dad hadn't picked up the dry cleaning as promised. But it started escalating. I noticed the tension at dinner, the awkward silences between them. But it wasn't until one evening that I realized something was seriously wrong. It was a typical evening, and we were all sitting around the dinner table. Mom had made one of her famous chicken casseroles, the kind that had always been a family favorite. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. Ryan was busy texting on his phone. Claire was playing with her food, and Mom was silent, barely making eye contact with Dad. It wasn't like her. Then, out of nowhere, Dad slammed his fist on the table. "Why is this so hard?" he spat, looking directly at Mom. "We're supposed to be a team, but you're making it impossible." I froze mid-bite. The entire table went silent, except for the sound of Ryan's phone vibrating against the table. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice sounding small, even to me. Mom's eyes flickered to mine, and I could see something in them that made my stomach twist. Pain, frustration, but also something else. Was it guilt? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at Dad, her face tight with emotion. "We're fine, honey," she said, forcing a smile. "Just grown-up stuff." But I knew something was wrong. They'd never fought like this before, not in front of us, not so openly, and they definitely didn't hide things from us. Or at least, I thought they didn't. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something big. But what was it? The tension continued to build over the next few weeks. Mom and Dad's arguments grew louder, and their silences between those arguments more oppressive. They were no longer speaking to each other with the same warmth I remembered. It was like watching 2 strangers coexisting in the same house. One night, after another particularly tense dinner, Dad left the table early, mumbling something about having to work. Mom stayed behind, picking at her food as if it no longer mattered. "Mom," I asked hesitantly, not sure if I should ask, but needing to understand. She looked up, her face strained, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her. "What is it, honey?" she asked, her voice too soft to be comforting. I shifted in my seat, suddenly nervous. "Are you and Dad okay?" Her expression faltered for a moment, just a flicker of something. Pain? Regret? But then, just as quickly, she put up her defenses. "We're fine, sweetheart. Grown-up stuff you wouldn't understand," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It didn't feel like everything was fine. The next morning, everything changed. I was woken up by the sound of my mom's sobs, muffled through the door. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed in bed, too scared to open it. But then I heard Ryan's voice from the hallway. He was talking to Mom, asking her what was going on. I couldn't hear all of it, but the words, "I think we need to take a break," pierced through the door like a knife. A break? From what? And that was the moment when everything began to unravel. The days following that conversation were a blur of confusion and tension. Mom and Dad behavior became even more distant, and their quiet fights started turning into full-blown arguments. One night, while I was heading to my room, I overheard part of a conversation between my parents that made my blood run cold. You don't get it. Dad's voice was shaking with anger. You've let him poison her mind, and now we're paying the price. Who's poisoning whose mind? Mom shot back. You've been blind to everything that's been happening right under your nose, Jim. She's not the same anymore. It was like hearing a different language, one I couldn't understand. Her? Who were they talking about? I stood frozen outside their door, straining to hear more, but the conversation quickly quieted. I didn't know what to make of it, but my heart was racing. I had no idea that this was where everything was leading, that this was the beginning of the end. A few days later, I found myself face to face with Ryan in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, flicking through a magazine, trying to block out the noise from the kitchen where Mom and Dad were arguing again. Ryan, on the other hand, was silent. He'd been more distant than usual, hardly speaking to anyone. Ryan, I asked, glancing up from the magazine, is everything okay? He didn't look at me at first, but when he did, his eyes were cold, colder than I had ever seen them. Everything's fine, he said with a tight smile. Don't worry about it. I frowned. You don't look fine. Is this about Mom and Dad? Ryan's gaze hardened, and for a moment I thought he might lash out, but instead he stood up abruptly, muttering under his breath. You wouldn't understand, he said. And then he left, just like that. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with 100 questions I couldn't answer. Why was Ryan acting so weird? What was going on between Mom and Dad? And why hadn't anyone told me what was really happening? As I lay there, unable to quiet my thoughts, I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was Claire getting up to use the bathroom. But then I realized it was someone else. Someone heavy, like Ryan. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding. I peeked through the crack in my door to see Ryan standing in front of my parents' bedroom, looking as if he were about to knock. But then he just stood there, staring at the door. I don't know what made me do it, but I quietly stepped out of my room and approached him. I didn't know what to say, but I had to ask. Ryan, what's going on? I whispered, trying not to wake anyone. He flinched as if he hadn't heard me approach. But when he turned around, his face was hard, closed off, like he was hiding something. Nothing, he said again, his voice tight. Just family stuff. I wanted to ask more, but something in his eyes made me hold back. It was like he was keeping a secret that had the power to shatter everything. Little did I know, it wasn't just a secret. It was a betrayal that would tear our family apart. It wasn't until 2 weeks after that night in the hallway that I finally started to put the pieces together. My parents were still in the midst of their tension-filled silence, and the strain between them was undeniable. The cracks in their marriage had turned into a chasm, and I was watching it all unfold in slow motion. But what hurt the most was that no one was talking to me about it. It was as if I had become invisible in my own family. The only one who seemed to be acting normal was Claire, and even she had started to notice the change. But unlike me, she didn't seem bothered. Maybe it was because she was still young, or maybe it was because she didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Either way, she was still too innocent to see the darker truths lurking beneath the surface. Ryan, on the other hand, had turned into a ghost. He wasn't just distant now, he was cold. He stopped joining us for dinner, opting instead to eat alone in his room or at a friend's house. He barely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words felt like sharp little daggers. And the way he looked at Mom and Dad, especially Dad, was different. It wasn't the same playful camaraderie they used to share. Now it was more like a quiet resentment. I tried to reach out to him, but every time I did, he pushed me away. It felt like he was shutting me out of his life entirely, and for the first time, I felt completely alone in my own home. One evening, as the rest of the house settled into its usual eerie silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I had to know what was going on. So, after hours of lying awake in bed, I decided to confront Ryan. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with his phone in hand, scrolling through it aimlessly. I took a deep breath and approached him. Ryan, I said, my voice trembling slightly, we need to talk. He didn't look up at first. His thumb kept moving across the screen of his phone, his attention entirely elsewhere. "About what?" he muttered, his tone flat and dismissive. "About everything," I replied, sitting down beside him. "About Mom and Dad. About what's going on. Why are you acting like this?" There was a long pause. He set his phone down and finally met my gaze, but there was nothing warm or familiar in his eyes. They were cold, hard, even. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me completely. But then he spoke. "I told you it's complicated," he said, his voice low. "You wouldn't understand." I leaned forward, the frustration building inside me. "I want to understand, Ryan. Please, just tell me. You've been acting like this for weeks. What's happening with Mom and Dad?" He sighed, rubbing his face as if the weight of the world were pressing down on him. "It's not just them, all right? It's me too. I'm part of the problem." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. Ryan looked away, his jaw tightening. "You want the truth? Fine." He paused, staring out the window. "I'm the reason Mom and Dad are falling apart." I blinked, unable to process what he was saying. "What? That doesn't make sense. What did you do? Don't you get it?" He snapped, suddenly turned to face me. "I've been manipulating them. I've been feeding them lies, stirring things up on purpose." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why would you do that?" Ryan's face twisted with frustration. "Because I needed them to split up. I needed them to fall apart. So I could have control over everything. Don't you get it?" I was speechless, too stunned to form a coherent thought. My brother, the one I had looked up to for so many years, the one who always seemed to have everything together, he was the reason my parents were headed toward divorce? Ryan seemed to sense my disbelief, and for the first time in weeks, he looked guilty, like he was actually ashamed of what he had done. But that didn't excuse what he had already done to the family. "You're not making any sense," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this to them? To all of us?" He rubbed his hands over his face, looking defeated. "It's not that simple. You don't know what it's like to be in my position. Dad's always been so focused on you, on making sure you're happy, making sure you have everything you need. He's never even seen me. And Mom, she's always been so wrapped up in her own little world. It was like I didn't even exist." I was stunned. "You're telling me you've been sabotaging their marriage because you felt ignored?" Ryan's eyes flickered with anger, but it quickly faded. "It's more complicated than that. It's not just about feeling ignored. It's about power, control. I wanted things to go my way for once. And the only way I could do that was by getting them to fight, to tear each other apart. I knew they'd start pointing fingers at each other, and eventually they'd end up blaming each other for everything that was wrong with the family." The room seemed to close in around me, and I suddenly felt suffocated. My head was spinning. How could Ryan, my own brother, be capable of something like this? How had I not seen it sooner? But why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you hurt everyone like this? Why not just talk to them?" Ryan gave a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Because I couldn't. Every time I tried to talk to them, they just dismissed me. So I had to take matters into my own hands." There it was, the ugly truth. Ryan had orchestrated this chaos from the very beginning. He had fueled the fire, pushing Mom and Dad further apart with lies and manipulation, all so he could have the control he so desperately craved. I could hardly breathe. How could my brother have done this to us? The next morning after my conversation with Ryan, I was numb. I couldn't even look at him. Every time I did, I saw a different person, a stranger in my brother's body. I knew I had to confront Mom and Dad. They had to know the truth. But the thought of shattering whatever was left of their relationship terrified me. Could they even survive something like this? But I couldn't just sit idly by. I couldn't let Ryan get away with this. That afternoon, I waited for Mom and Dad come home. When they did, I pulled them aside, away from Claire and Ryan. I didn't want anyone else to hear this, especially Ryan. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. Mom looked at me with concern, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong, honey?" I hesitated for a moment, But then the truth spilled out. Ryan, he's the one behind all of this. He's been manipulating you both, spreading lies, causing all this tension. He's been trying to make you two hate each other. The silence in the room was deafening. Mom and Dad stared at me, their faces frozen in shock. No, Mom said, shaking her head in disbelief. That's impossible. Ryan would never. I'm telling you the truth, I said, my voice stronger now. He admitted it. He said he wanted control, wanted things to go his way. That's why everything is falling apart. Dad's face grew pale as he processed the words. Ryan, he did this? Yes, I said, my voice cracking. He did. The aftermath of that conversation was more painful than I could ever have imagined. Mom and Dad were devastated, not just by the betrayal, but by the fact that they had been blind to it for so long. The rift between them widened, and it was as though the last shred of hope had been ripped away. Ryan didn't take it well when he found out that I had told him everything. He confronted me later that evening, his face twisted with fury. You're a traitor, he screamed, his voice trembling with rage. You have no idea what you've done. You've ruined everything. I stood my ground, refusing to let him manipulate me any longer. No, Ryan, you ruined it. You ruined this family. But in his eyes, there was no remorse, only anger, pure and unfiltered. It was as if the person I had once loved and looked up to was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. In the days following my confrontation with Ryan, the house was nothing short of a war zone. The silence that once hung over our home was replaced with tension, hurt, and almost unbearable heaviness. Mom and Dad hardly spoke to each other anymore. They would go days without acknowledging the other's presence, their communication limited to short, curt sentences. The once bustling house now felt hollow, as if everything had been sucked out of it. Claire, innocent as she was, couldn't understand why things were so different. She would ask, with her big, round eyes, why Mom and Dad weren't smiling anymore, why Ryan was always locked away in his room, and why I looked like I'd been crying. I didn't have the answers for her. I didn't know how to make sense of it all. All I knew was that the family I had once thought would never fall apart was disintegrating before my eyes. And it was all because of Ryan. Mom was the first one to crack. It came on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after everything had been exposed. I found her sitting in the kitchen, staring at the wall, her hand clutching a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Mom, I said softly, walking toward her. Are you okay?